When you first enter my room, you immediately encounter a marquee box with the phrase, "Member the Sting," sitting on top of the dresser in front of my bed. It's a reference to the summer of 2023, when I was stung by a bee for the first time. I also lost my mind. That summer, I developed psychosis, which is defined as a disconnect from reality characterized by symptoms including, but not limited to, grandiose thinking, erratic behavior, violent tendencies, and fragmented thought patterns. In psychosis, unrelated events seem connected. So while to a non-psychotic brain, a bee sting is merely itchy and inconvenient, to psychotic me, it was a divine sign. It was God directing me, a magical, otherworldly being, to the truth. Before I get too personal, let me introduce myself. My name is Charifi, and at Bowdoin, I major in psychology, minor in English, and obsessively philosophize. So it's safe to say that I really like to think. A lot. It's been a defining characteristic since my youth and one of my favorite hobbies. But despite being a self-proclaimed certified ponderer, there were certain truths about myself that I was avoiding thinking about and running away from. And the culmination of the stress from this deflection ultimately culminated in a mental break, which is what I'm here to talk about today. Drawing from my own experience, I will be contributing to the conversation around the transformative potential of mental breakdowns. I believe that these moments are not merely crises, but our mind's way of forcing us to confront the emotional traumas and conflicts that we're avoiding. In exploring their philosophical interpretations and psychological dimensions, I suggest that introspection is the key to making breakdowns into breakthroughs. As a quick disclaimer, it's really important to note that I'm not suggesting that emotional avoidance is the sole cause for mental breaks. Rather, it is the way that we respond to our unmet emotional needs that cause a mental breakdown or transform it into potential for positive change. So what is a mental breakdown? It's not a clinical term, but is used to describe a moment in which an individual is incapable of figuring out their day-to-day activities, and that is characterized by a mental crisis. These crises include psychotic episodes, but also range from impulsive aggression, temper tantrums, mania, and burnout. Symptoms of a mental crisis also vary as well, with weight gain and weight loss, isolation, increased academic performance, and decreased academic performance being some of them. Isolating the onset of a mental breakdown is also highly dependent on an individual's context of their lived experience, as well as the socio-cultural norms in which they configure themselves in. So take, for instance, a practicing Muslim in the Middle Eastern North African region who is engaged to be wed. One day, she tells her friend that she suspects, because God has given her signs, that someone is practicing black magic to get her fiancé to call off their engagement. Given her religious background and her cultural context, this might not be a sign of a mental break. But if a very vocal, at the time, atheist such as myself claims that God is sending her messages through Drake and Travis Scott's Fair Trade, that might be a sign. Mental breakdowns often feel like a tipping point, a harsh dividing line between before and after. And my dividing line was my bee sting. But while it wasn't the catalyst for my mental breakdown, it was the moment that signified things that began to feel surreal. But in order to contextualize this period of my life, I need to introduce you to CBPE. Chayma before psychotic episode. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are a deeply insecure and stressed out college student. Some of you don't need to exercise much imagination for that one. You are a perfectionist in every sense of the word, and base your self-worth on academic achievements and how much people like you. You are the type of person to seriously question whether or not you're a narcissist for forgetting someone's birthday, but are quick to excuse intentional harm done onto you, telling yourself that there must have been a reason for why they did what they did, or everyone can change anyway. You respond to your traumatic events the same way you respond to a piece of fiction. You intellectualize it and move on, creating an emotional distance. At the start of your sophomore year, you are the most insecure version of yourself. Meanwhile, some of your friends, close and casual, are telling you to humble yourself and tone it down, which contradicts the debilitating insecurities that you've confided in them about. Nonetheless, you disregard your previously highly important to you priorities and live to therapize, ironically, these friends, because these are the moments in which you feel most validated. When you occasionally assert your needs and decline a hangout, they feel upset, guilt shame you, you fall back in, you join them, only for them to drop you at a moment's notice for something or someone more important that comes along, like a boy they met 2 weeks ago. You are coping with anything that comes your way. You don't recognize yourself in the mirror, and all of the standards that you previously had for anything at all drop to zero. That initial insecurity turns into complete and utter self-contempt. The night after your 20th birthday, you make a series of questionable decisions that should have sent you into cardiac arrest. But not only are you surviving, you're thriving. You're hit with an intense sense of clarity. You hate your friends. You hate everyone. In fact, you've put the puzzle pieces together and have realized they're all out to get you. A couple of hours later, you go on Spotify and you receive messages from some omniscient presence. God, is that you? When I was in psychosis, I believed that every interaction, every event was part of a larger cosmic scheme in which I was the protagonist. You see, when Travis Scott said, "I let it slide when I really should have slid," after all the redacted I did, look at how they were paying me back, that was God telling me that my friends were conspiring against me, obviously. Why do I know this? Well, because God sent me on a prophetic mission that was unbeknownst to me up until this point, but my friends had known about all along and were sent out to prevent me from accomplishing. A couple of hours after my bee sting, I was hospitalized, and my routine was set up in a way to keep me medicated, busy, and constantly around other patients. We had break time, in which we had nothing to do but the 2 recreational outlets that were available: a TV with channels we had no control over, coloring sheets, and a couple of copies of the New Testament Bible, which were helpful to me for obvious reasons. So naturally, there was nothing left to do but talk to the other patients. And these patients were often depressed, suicidal, and often very psychotic. And so, understandably, we fostered this ecosystem of delusion in which the absence of any meaningful intervention exacerbated the previous disconnect from reality we already had. If you came into the hospital thinking that you were part of the royal British bloodline, you left convinced you were the second coming of Christ. My fog of delusion only lifted when I, ironically, was discharged from the hospital, with access to my own personal space, and with the time, space, and ability to introspect and in the way that I wanted. I had a plane ticket and a dream. I left the country for a year, became an English teacher, and set out on my life's mission, figuring out what was wrong with me. As I mentioned before, I am a certified ponderer, so a researcher to my core. I took this on like I would an honors thesis, sifting through diary entries from my childhood up to CPE, going through old texts, looking through old social media posts, getting anything that could inform me into who I was. I treated this breakdown as an investigation of my own mind because the answers weren't in oversimplified healthcare, they were within me. Ironically, in my year of unrelenting introspection, I came to these same conclusions that I had when I was psychotic, firstly, with the fact that I am important. But don't worry, it's not because I'm a prophet. I came to the conclusion that I was important because I exist. I'm alive, thus I matter, irrespective of any external validation. I also came to another important breakthrough, that these delusions weren't random, but they also weren't any sort of divine intervention. In a way, my psychosis was attempting to have me confront this internalized narrative that I had instilled in me for so long, that I wasn't valuable, that I wasn't important, that I didn't matter. And the only way that it could illustrate this to me was through a fantastical, extreme narrative to get me to truly feel the importance I'd so desperately longed for. It wasn't really about the academic stress or the platonic rejection. It was about how those events triggered pre-existing insecurities, anxieties, and trauma-based beliefs that I had been avoiding. There's been long-standing debate around the reasons for mental breakdowns and their solutions. Thinkers like philosophers William James and Wilhelm Wundt, writer Emily Sprout, psychologist and psychohistorian Julian Jaynes have all been key thinkers in these conversations. I personally side with Julian Jaynes' theory of introspection and the self, which builds upon Immanuel Kant's epistemology of the transcendentalist ego. Nerd moment. In his work, Origin of the Conscious Mind, the breakdown of the bicameral mind, he posits that the modern mental breakdown is a reemergence of the prehistoric bicameral mind in which humans had yet to develop self-awareness. So when fragmentation of the self happens, which is a mental breakdown, it is because one is, instead of being truly conscious, drowning in sensory data. Thus, psychological breakdowns are manifestations of neurological commands. In his theory, he posits that the mind is made up of two parts. One half gives the other commands, and then the other listens and follows. And so, prehistorically, he theorizes that people didn't think the way that we do now. Instead of thinking, I want to do this thing, they hear a voice in their head telling them what to do. And this voice isn't an extension of the self, but rather an external command that you would get, like draw on the wall, or eat the berries, or obnoxiously grunt, or whatever cavemen do. When society developed, the bicameral mind broke down because it was too complex for these two isolated spheres of the brain to communicate with each other separately. And so to Jaynes, when breakdowns happen, when the fragmentation of the self happens, it is because one is not conscious, because one is not self-aware, because the prehistoric way that the mind has worked has re-emerged into the modern day. Introspection, prompting the fostering of the fragmented brain, could be the key in getting someone out of mental breakdown. Modern thinkers like Alan de Botton posit that mental breakdowns are not only helpful, but purposeful, and the mind's way of forcing us to confront truths that we're avoiding. In his words, he says that when one's mind breaks, they are on a quest for health. They haven't become ill, they're ill already. Psychologists have recommended therapeutic approaches to encourage introspection and this idea of the observing ego as delineated in Jaynes' theory. And while those can be helpful, I think it is on the individual themselves, the ones most knowledgeable about their lived experience, to take the time to pick apart their beliefs, their things, their triggers, day by day, in a way that would honestly be really difficult to address in therapy. I'm not saying that you should ditch your meds, ghost your therapist, or move to another country. Therapy can be very helpful, medication can be helpful as well, and hospitalization is often necessary, especially in cases of harm or potential harm to oneself or others. What I am saying, though, is that self-exploration, unabashed, brave exploration, confronting your deep-seated fears head-on instead of running from them, are where true breakthroughs emerge. They come from picking apart trauma-based beliefs triggered by day-to-day experiences. Like, in my case, those friends I mentioned earlier just didn't respect me. That's it. The questions that I should have asked myself long before CPE are, 1, why didn't I just end the friendships? 2, why did I crave their validation so badly when they only made me feel poorly about myself? And 3, when did I first learn to disrespect myself in this way? Even in seemingly silly moments like this 12-year-old Facebook post that will forever be immortalized on the internet, to this day, I can find it very, very difficult to leave the house if I'm having a bad hair day or am not looking my best. When did I first learn that I was unacceptable if I didn't show up as physically attractive in places where my appearance didn't even matter in the first place? If it takes external factors like medication, therapy, or Drake's Certified Lover Boy album to get you to a place where you can introspect, then do so, and do so shamelessly. But in the end, I encourage you to return to yourself. Stay away from the noise. Destigmatize legitimate responses to pain. Pick apart your preconceived notions. Challenge your breakthroughs and understand that the work is never done. Your life will and should be defined by constant breakthroughs, sometimes with conflicting resolutions. Will it take institutionalization to address these deep-seated qualms, anxieties, and insecurities, or will you face them head-on before they accumulate? Either way, remember,